Wільям Bраудер is a founder and CEO of the Hermitage Capital Management. He was the biggest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was blacklisted by the Russian government for revealing corruption. He has been advocating for Magnitsky Act for many years. Welcome to the program, Mr. Braudera.
Great to be here.
You consider yourself as the number one enemy, foreign enemy of the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Also, you said that dictator Putin would like you to be dead. Why does Vladimir Putin want you to be dead?
Well, because I'm the person who is most responsible for the Magnitsky Act being passed in the United States and in 34 other countries around the world. The Magnitsky Act freezes the assets and bans the travel of Russian human rights violators and kleptocrats. Putin is a human rights violator and a kleptocrat, and most importantly, he has lots of money stashed all over the world, and he values money more than human life, and I put his money at risk. And so he's very angry at me and very angry at everybody else who played a role in the passage of the Magnitsky Act, and that included people like Boris Nemtsov, who was killed, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was also, they tried to assassinate and then sentenced him to 25 years in prison. And of course, Sergei Magnitsky, who they also killed, and then they put him on trial 3 years after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in Russian history. Putin is a very vindictive man, and he particularly doesn't like people going near his money.
Russian dictator Putin is afraid of his own people and he's on the ropes. That's what you said in one of your interviews on Times Radio. Does that mean that dictator Putin is a coward?
Well, what it says is that Putin is scared of losing power, because if he loses power, he loses all his money, he goes to jail, and he probably dies. That's usually what happens to dictators, and certainly dictators in Russia. And so from in early times, 10, 15 years ago, he could try to keep people from throwing him out by basically paying them. When there was money around to throw around, he could basically pay the Russian people, give them more money. But as the economy has started to stagnate and go down, he can no longer pay people. He can no longer provide them with any incentive to support him. And so all he really has is disincentives, meaning repression to keep people in line. And so it's a very unpleasant place to live in Russia, because you say one bad word and all of a sudden you're off to jail, or you lose your job, or something else terrible like that happens to you. So he's living in a very fragile world where anything could happen, and he's scared. There's no question.
Ukraine does not recognize Vladimir Putin as a legitimate president of Russia. You also urged Western governments not to recognize Putin as a legitimate president. Why don't Western leaders want to call a spade a spade?
Well, we have been living for 24 years in a world of appeasement. Western leaders were appeasing Putin. I would argue that the appeasement was the reason why Putin felt confident enough to invade Ukraine in the first place. It's very much of course, he's primarily responsible for the invasion, but the Western governments who have been appeasing him effectively gave him the thought that he could do it without any real objection. And so now we're in this situation where there's still appeasement. As you said, he wasn't legitimately elected. He's killed or imprisoned or exiled all of his political opponents, and then he runs a fake election and he claims to be the victor. He's not the legitimate leader of Russia. He's not a leader at all. He's a fraud.
Let's cover also Western sanctions against Russia. From your perspective, are that sanctions effective? Are they inflicting enough damage on Russian economy to make any difference?
Well, there's a lot of sanctions that have been very effective and inflicted a lot of damage. Freezing the Russian central bank reserves, of course, was a big one. Freezing the oligarch assets is another big one. Blocking Russian banks and companies from the international capital markets is another big one. Getting most Western companies to pull out, that's also very important. This has all inflicted a lot of pain on Russia, but there's still one huge thing that hasn't inflicted pain, which is that Russia continues to sell oil into the international markets and earn hundreds of billions of dollars every year from doing that. And as long as they earn that money, they can afford the war. And as long as they can afford the war, that's not a good thing. And so we have to figure out some way of depriving them of those oil revenues. And of course, the West is very worried about the oil price going up. And so that's a problem. But at the same time, if Russia continues to fight this war, the West will continue to have to pay money to support Ukraine. And so it's kind of a catch-22. And I would argue that we should just tighten our belts, try to produce more oil in other countries, and embargo the Russian oil.
But what would it take for the West to inflict unbearable pain on Russian economy from your perspective?
If the West imposed an oil embargo on Russia, they couldn't last more than 9 months before the war would end because they just wouldn't have the money to do it anymore.
How would it look like in the reality, this embargo, from your perspective?
Well, what would have to happen is that countries that produce oil outside of Russia would have to increase production so we didn't have a world shortage of oil, because Russia produces about 10% of the world's oil production. And so we need the Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the United States of America would all have to start producing more oil. And then we would impose absolutely crippling sanctions on anybody who bought Russian oil, and then they would stop buying Russian oil. We would pose sanctions on the refineries in India, China, and Turkey. We would impose sanctions on the shipping companies and insurance companies that move the oil. And by doing so, Russia would basically be in a position where they couldn't sell their oil and wouldn't get the money, and then wouldn't be able to fight this war.
It seems like Ukraine is also imposing its own sanctions on Russia's oil refineries. Bloomberg reported that Ukraine successfully inflicted damaged 14% of Russia's oil refining capacity. What is your take on such results?
I think it's excellent. The only problem with that statistic is there's another 86% to go. So I think Ukraine needs to step up its attacks on Russian oil refineries.
It seems like Western leaders do not like such attacks inside Russian territory. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I think it's all very sort of fuzzy thinking, because on one hand, it's in our interest in the West that Ukraine wins, because if Ukraine loses, then we end up with Russia on our doorstep. And on the other hand, you have these very unhelpful statements about not striking within Russia oil refineries or other legitimate targets. And I think that the Western leaders who are making those statements should withdraw them and allow Ukraine to get on with the job. You can't have Russia attacking critical infrastructure in Ukraine and not be able to respond in kind.
It also seems like the West, the United States, are ready to impose sanctions against those banks in Turkey, in China, who are helping Russian economy, helping to conduct such transactions. How could it be damaging for the Russian financial system?
Basically, the key is just to isolate everything in Russia. And there's been a lot that has been isolated, but of course the Russians are smart, and they've found enablers outside of Russia, like those banks that you've just mentioned, who do this kind of thing. And so it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You hit one thing and then another thing pops up, and you just have to keep on hitting all these different institutions that are trying to help Russia until people understand that by doing so, they risk their own economic freedom and their own economic prosperity.
Let's cover also British sanctions, possible sanctions against Russian oligarchs in the United Kingdom. Do you feel that the UK is ready to move forward in this matter?
Well, the UK, interestingly, we did an analysis of how many of the top 96 oligarchs who were defined by the US government as being oligarchs close to Putin. We said how many were sanctioned by the UK versus the US versus the EU. And I think the number was 57 were sanctioned in the UK. I think about 30 in the US and something less than that in the 20s in the EU. So the UK is actually doing better than the other countries in terms of major oligarchs. Having said that, there's still quite a few to go. I'm afraid that the level of sort of feverish intensity has been lost more than 2 years into the war. And the only way that more sanctions will be imposed is if Putin does something more terrible. It's always my experience that Putin does something more terrible, so I would imagine there will be more sanctions against some more oligarchs in the future, but unfortunately that's going to come after some other atrocity that he commits, which will be terrible for those victims.
During your speech in the British Parliament, you said that confiscation of Russia's frozen assets would dramatically change the nature of the war in Ukraine. As Russia continues its war in Ukraine, even without access to such frozen assets, how can it prevent Russia or force Russia to end the war in Ukraine? How can it change the nature of the war?
Well, war is ultimately a war of resources. Russia has the dominant resources. And look, we spent 6 months in this terrible delay of the U.S. money, the $61 billion. It finally came. It came too late. Many Ukrainians have been killed because of that delay. The money will eventually find its way to the battlefield, and that will help Ukraine. But if we were fighting over $61 billion, there's this much bigger opportunity, which is 5 times bigger, which is the frozen Russian central bank reserves. And in my mind, that solves the resource problem for quite some time. That doesn't mean Ukraine wins the war, but that means that Ukraine has a good fighting chance, and potentially Russia capitulates at some point because they run out of money. I mean, it's not as if they have an unlimited amount of money and they've got all sorts of other issues on their side.
But it seems like Russia still can continue its war even without the access to the frozen assets. How can it be harmful for the Russian financial system from an economic point of view?
Well, what I would say is that Russia hasn't been able to get that money, and of course that's very helpful. Most importantly, it would help Ukraine because Ukraine needs that money. And if Ukraine needs that money, then it requires Russia to then get more money on their side to continue the fight. The other thing I would say is that Putin values money more than human life. That's why he hates me so much. And in addition to helping Ukraine, this is just a very, very powerful 2 fingers in the eye to Putin to show him what he values the most will be taken away from him.
Does it mean that he is really afraid of possible confiscation of that frozen assets?
I think he's terrified of it. He starts threatening nuclear war every time it's discussed. I think this is the thing other than more ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles. This is the thing he fears the most, I think.
Is it his worst nightmare?
Maybe not the worst nightmare, but I think it's something that keeps him up at night for sure. I think this is something that really bothers him. You can see by his own reaction.
G7 leaders are ready to use revenues from such frozen assets to help Ukraine. Reuters recently reported the story. Would it be enough for Ukraine to receive only revenues from such frozen assets?
No, definitely not. I mean, look, this war is costing a huge amount for Ukraine. Those revenues are a tiny fraction of the amount of money that Ukraine needs. That seems to me to be a fudge, compromise, a bad decision. It doesn't help the problem significantly.
But is it better than nothing?
Definitely better than nothing, but it's not a whole lot compared to the needs of Ukraine. And so I think that this is a bad compromise. I think it's an interim bad compromise. We always see Europe in the end coming to the right decision. It just takes them longer because there's so many of them, and a few of them are friends of Putin within the European Union.
What Western leaders are most afraid of in this matter of confiscation of Russian assets? They are afraid of possible financial retaliation?
Well, what you hear is people, the Germans don't like it because they're afraid the Poles will come to them and say that we want you to give us money for World War II. The Belgians don't like it because all the money is held in Belgium. And the central bank, Christine Lagarde, doesn't like it because she thinks it'll make her job more difficult. But generally, when you look at it, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, why should the European taxpayers have less right to their money than Putin has to his money? And that's the ultimate thing that's going to push this thing in the right direction.
Despite the European Union, it seems like the US government is ready to move forward with confiscation of Russian assets. Such bill has been adopted by the US Congress. Do you believe that the US is ready to confiscate such assets, not only to use revenues from these assets?
I think the US is absolutely ready to do it, but I don't think the US will go it alone. I think the US needs to do this in a multilateral effort with other countries, because if you do it by yourself, then it makes your country and your currency look less risky. I'm sorry, more risky than other countries. And so if everybody, all the major reserve currency countries do this together, then there's no place for people to keep their money, and it doesn't change anything in the investment climate.
Let's cover also financial sanctions against banks. There is a Raiffeisen Bank International who still has some business ties with Russia, and also there are some other banks. What would it take for the West to force them to stop doing business with Russia?
Well, I would imagine that if the U.S. Treasury threatens to withdraw their license to move dollars, that will change their behavior in a heartbeat. The U.S. government has a great capacity to change banks' behavior by making those types of threats, and I'm amazed that Raiffeisen has been so stubborn about this, because it's clear that it upsets all of Austria's neighbors, the allies, etc. And push comes to shove, the U.S. has been known to make very serious threats to banks. And if they cut off Raiffeisen's access to dollars, then Raiffeisen no longer is a bank for all intents and purposes.
But do you believe that the U.S. government is able to disrupt financial business, financial ties between, for example, Chinese, Turkish banks and Russian one? Do they have such leverage, such influence on such banks which are located so far away from the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. Every bank has to be able to move dollars. If they can't move dollars, they're effectively not a bank. The U.S. has the capacity to shut off banks who they don't like from the dollar system. And therefore, U.S. has the absolute leverage, if they need to and they want to make Turkish banks, Chinese banks, Indian banks, Austrian banks behave themselves. No bank ever wants to be put on the blacklist and cut off from the U.S.
What are they waiting for, from your perspective?
Well, I think at the moment, everyone is trying it out to see how much they can get away with. It's very profitable for banks to move money from Russia because there's so few options for the Russians. And so everybody is weighing up, are the profits worth the risk? And so what the U.S. government needs to do is say, no, the risk is catastrophic for you. Don't do this.
Don't you feel that there is a couple of sanctions which are not already used, which the United States tries to save for example, for a last resort? Do you feel that there are some such sanctions for a last resort?
No, I don't think so. I think that most of the sanctions have already been used. I mean, now we can take these same sanctions that have been used and use them better. But and actually, let me correct myself. There is one sanction of last resort which hasn't been used, which is what we discussed before, which is an oil embargo. That doesn't seem probable, but that would be the thing that would be completely devastating to Russia if it was used.
Also, it seems like the United Kingdom is moving forward with sanctions against Russia's nuclear facility, Russia's uranium. What is your take on that, on this role of Russia on the uranium market?
Well, of course, we know that Russia is up to no good on the uranium market, and of course, up to no good occupying the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and up to no good assisting rogue regimes like Iran with their nuclear program. And so, anything that we can do to kneecap, to disable Russia's nuclear proliferation program and that of their allies is something that should be done very aggressively.
You mentioned about Iran. I just want to ask you about this catastrophe. Iranian president died in the air catastrophe in a helicopter recently. What are your thoughts on this development, and can it influence the international economy, for example, and situation in Iran and around the globe?
Well, for sure. I mean, first of all, the president of Iran is a murderous dictator who's killed many, many people. I know many Iranians that are celebrating his demise. Whenever their head of state dies, then it raises all sorts of questions about who's going to succeed him. Is it going to be another hardliner? Is it going to be somebody else? And then, of course, it also raises questions in other parts of the world. We don't know how he died. Was this an attack organized by a hostile enemy of Iran? Was this an accident? We don't know. But as much as we don't know, other dictators around the world don't know. I'm sure Vladimir Putin is sitting there thinking, God, could this happen to me? And so it raises all sorts of questions all over the board. I think it's way too early to make any conclusions, but surely this will be in the minds of lots of people, and it will definitely lead to some types of change. We don't know what yet.
What is your prediction on the state of economic affairs between the United States and China, and between the European Union and China? How do you see the future of this economic cooperation?
Well, what we see right now is that many countries are very dependent on China for cheap goods. China is a great exporter of products. If you look inside the labels of things you buy, many of them are made in China. At the same time, China has used its economic leverage very aggressively in certain cases. And from that, many companies are trying to become less dependent on China. And this has had a number of effects. I think one of the main effects is that China's economic growth has slowed down considerably. And so I don't think that the West is going to be able to decouple from China completely, but over time you're going to see a very serious and deliberate decoupling as countries or companies try to become less dependent. And that's not good for China, probably not good for the world, but China put itself in this position where we can't rely on China. China is no longer considered to be a friendly country.
Russian dictator Putin is also trying to strengthen his economic relations with China. Do you believe that a Chinese leader would give Putin everything he wants?
No, absolutely not. I think that China is looking at this as an opportunity to get cheap oil, maybe a few other cheap raw materials. China looks at Russia as an opportunity to sell Chinese products where the Russians used to buy Western products. But beyond that, I think that China is not going to openly support Russia in terms of weapons, because if it did that, then they would be subject to even more sanctions. And China doesn't need that with an economy that's not doing so well right now. And so they started out by saying this is a friendship that knows no boundaries. I think there's lots of boundaries around this friendship, and it's not like a life-saving friendship for Russia. It's helps China a little bit, but helps Russia a little bit and doesn't change the game.
Thank you, Mr. Browder, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.